I still remember the exact sound of the silence that came after his hand hit my face. Not the slap itself, but the silence. That heavy, suffocating pause where even the air in the room seemed to stop moving. My name is Karen Miller, and I spent 21 years connected to the U.S. military first, as active duty, later as a reservist. I've been trained to stay calm under pressure to assess threats before reacting to keep my emotions locked down when everything around me is falling apart. But nothing in my training prepared me for what happened in my own living room that afternoon. It started like so many of our arguments had started over the last year, small, tense, controlled at first. The kind of disagreement that pretends to be about something simple like homework or dinner plans, but is really about everything that has been breaking between two people for a long time. Our 2 kids were there. That was the part I can never forget. My youngest was sitting cross-legged on the carpet, pretending to play a game on his tablet, but clearly listening. My stepdaughter, well, I never called her that, and my heart was sitting on the couch, watching both of us like she was trying to decide which version of her world was real. My husband Daniel stood near the kitchen counter with his arms crossed. He had that look again, the one I used to think was stress. Now I recognize it for what it really is, control trying to find a way out. "You always make everything complicated," he said. I kept my voice steady. "I'm not making it complicated. I'm asking you to talk to the kids about what you promised them." That was enough to set him off. He stepped forward, one step, then another. "You don't get to tell me how to parent," he snapped. "They're my kids, too." I shook my head slowly. "I'm not saying that. I'm just saying consistency matters." That word consistency was like pouring gasoline on a fire I didn't even realize was already burning. His face tightened. His voice dropped. "You think you're the only one who knows what's best for this family because you wore a uniform." I felt that familiar military instinct kick in the part of me that calculates instead of reacts. I told myself to stay calm, stay grounded, don't escalate. But then he turned toward my stepdaughter, and everything changed. He pointed at me and said, "Don't listen to her. She's not your real mother anyway. She never was." For a second I thought I misunderstood him. Because that wasn't just anger. That was something deeper, something deliberate. My stepdaughter froze. I saw it in her hands. First they stopped moving. Then her eyes shifted from him to me like she was suddenly unsure of what she was allowed to feel. I had raised her since she was 7 years old. I was the one who stayed up when she had nightmares. I was the one who sat in school meetings when no one else showed up. I was the one who learned her allergies, her fears, her favorite foods. But in that moment he erased all of it with one sentence. And then it happened. He turned back toward me and slapped me. Right there, in front of both children. The sound cracked through the room like something breaking that you can't glue back together. My head turned slightly from the force, but I didn't fall. I didn't even stumble. Years of training kept my body upright even when everything inside me wanted to collapse. I touched my cheek slowly. It was burning, not just physically but emotionally, like my brain was trying to process what my body already understood. My son gasped. My stepdaughter made a sound I can still hear in my sleep. Daniel stood there breathing hard like he was waiting for a reaction that would justify what he had just done. Maybe yelling, maybe crying, maybe chaos. But I didn't give him that. Instead I looked at him. And I smiled. Not a warm smile. Not a forgiving one. Something quieter. Something controlled. Something that made him pause. I could see it in his eyes, that moment of confusion. That split second where he realized I wasn't responding the way he expected. I slowly lowered my hand from my face. And I said very calmly, "Since you brought that up." I didn't finish the sentence. Because I didn't need to. The room changed after that. The air felt different. Even my husband stopped breathing the same way. My stepdaughter looked between us, her face pale like she was trying to understand which adult she was supposed to trust. My son stood up from the floor, unsure if he should move toward me or stay frozen where he was. And Daniel, he just stared at me like he was suddenly aware that something had shifted, something he couldn't see but could definitely feel. That was the moment I realized something important. This wasn't just anger anymore. This was a line being crossed that could never be uncrossed. And for the first time since I met him, I didn't feel like I was inside a marriage. I felt like I was inside a situation that was about to end. I turned slightly, just enough to break eye contact, and walked toward the hallway without saying another word. But inside my mind, everything had already started moving. Not emotionally, strategically. Because in the military, we learned something very simple. You don't react to the blow. You respond to what comes after it. And what came after that slap was going to change everything. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was crying. I wasn't. I lay there in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet sound of Daniel moving around the house like nothing had happened. That was what bothered me most, not the slap itself, but the way he tried to pretend the world had not shifted. At around midnight, he finally came into the bedroom. He didn't look at me at first. He just took off his shirt, tossed it onto the chair, and acted like this was any other night in any other marriage. "You shouldn't have pushed me like that," he said casually. I didn't respond. That silence irritated him more than an argument would have. He turned toward me. "I told you before, don't correct me in front of the kids." I slowly sat up. My cheek still had a dull ache, but the pain wasn't really there anymore. What I felt instead was something clearer: detachment. The kind of clarity you only get when your emotions finally step aside and let your mind take over. "I didn't push you," I said quietly. "I asked you to keep your word to them." He shook his head like I was missing the point. "You don't understand how I have to handle them." That sentence stayed with me longer than anything else he had said that day. Not because it was loud, but because it revealed something I had been ignoring for a long time. Handle them, not guide them, not raise them. Handle them. I looked at him for a moment, really looked at him. This was the man I had built a life with after leaving active duty. The man I trusted to be stable when I was deployed. The man who once told me he admired how steady I stayed under pressure, and now he couldn't even control his voice in his own bedroom. I turned away from him slightly. "You shouldn't have said what you said to her." He let out a short laugh. "What about her not being your real daughter? It's the truth." That was the second time he had said it so casually, and something inside me tightened, because that wasn't just anger anymore. That was repetition. That was practice. That meant he had said it before when I wasn't around. I didn't answer him right away. Instead, I asked something very calm. "How long have you been telling her that?" He paused, just for a second, but I caught it. That hesitation, that tiny crack in his confidence. "Don't twist this," he said. "She deserves to know the truth." I nodded slowly like I was absorbing his explanation. But inside my mind, something very different was happening. Because I already knew the truth, not his version, the real one. My stepdaughter Emily came into my life when she was 7. Her mother had left early, and Daniel was struggling more than he admitted at the time. I stepped in not because I had to, but because I chose to. I raised her through school forms, fevers, school plays, nightmares, and everything in between. She called me mom before she ever fully understood what the word meant, and I never corrected her. But over the last year, something had been changing. Subtle things first. She stopped sitting next to me at dinner. She started looking at Daniel before answering me. She began hesitating when I gave instructions, like she was waiting for permission from someone else, and I had ignored it. I told myself it was just teenage distance, normal development, blended family complexity. But now I understood something I didn't want to see before. It wasn't distance. It was direction. Daniel had been quietly repositioning her perception of me for months, maybe longer. I had seen it, but I hadn't named it. And that was my mistake. That night after he fell asleep, I got up quietly and went into the kitchen. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the table in the dark. From there, I could see the hallway leading to the kids' rooms. And I started thinking like I used to think in the military, not emotionally, structurally. What is stable? What is compromised? What is being influenced? And what is still intact? I realized something that made my stomach tighten. My son still trusted me completely. But Emily, my stepdaughter, was no longer neutral. She was being positioned, not violently, not openly, but carefully, repeatedly, over time. And that was far more dangerous than anger. Because anger passes. Influence stays. I opened my phone and started doing something I hadn't done in years unless it was necessary for duty. I began documenting, not out of revenge, out of clarity. Times, statements, behavioral shifts, specific incidents, exact phrases. My military training had always taught me one thing. If you cannot control the situation, yet you document it until you can. By the time I finished, it was nearly 2:30 a.m. I looked down at the screen and felt something unexpected. Not anger. Not sadness, but recognition. This wasn't a sudden breakdown. This was a system that had been building quietly in front of me while I was trying to keep everything stable. And now I finally saw it for what it was. I closed the phone and whispered into the dark room almost to myself. This is not just about what happened today. This has been happening for a long time. And for the first time since the slap, I didn't feel shocked anymore. I felt awake. By the next morning, the house felt different. Not because anything had changed on the surface. The same kitchen, the same smell of coffee, the same kids getting ready for school with half-awake expressions and backpacks dragged across the floor. But something invisible had shifted. The kind of shift you only notice when you've lived long enough to recognize tension that doesn't announce itself. Daniel was already at the table when I came in. He didn't mention the night before. Not the slap, not the words, not the silence that followed. Instead, he was scrolling on his phone like he was waiting for the world to return to normal if he acted like nothing had happened. "Morning," he said without looking up. I replied the same way I always had. Calm, controlled, morning. Emily came in next. She hesitated in the doorway when she saw me. Just for a second too long. That hesitation used to be nothing. Now it felt like distance taking shape. "Hey, sweetie," I said gently. She nodded but didn't answer. She went straight to the cabinet, grabbed a bowl, and avoided my eyes completely. Daniel noticed it too. I could tell from the way his posture relaxed slightly. Not relief. Control. That's what it looked like when he thought something was working. My son Jason sat down next to me and immediately started talking about school. Normal, open, unfiltered. He still hadn't been pulled into whatever was happening. But Emily, she was different now. Not openly rebellious. Not emotional. Just uncertain. And uncertainty is where influence takes root. Daniel finally put his phone down. "I'm taking them to school today," he said. That was new. He usually didn't do mornings. I looked at him. "I've got it." He shook his head. "No, I'll handle it." There it was again. That word. Handle. I said nothing, but I watched Emily's reaction carefully. She didn't respond. She didn't argue. She just nodded slightly like it didn't matter who took her. But I saw it. The shift. She was beginning to adjust herself to him. Not because she trusted him more, but because she was learning which version of reality required less resistance. After they left, the house became too quiet. That kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels monitored. I stood in the kitchen for a long time after the door closed. My reflection in the window looked almost unfamiliar. Not because I didn't recognize my face, but because I recognized the version of myself that used to ignore patterns like this. I used to think stability meant endurance. Stay, hold, absorb, maintain. That was how I survived deployment. That was how I survived years in structured chaos. But this wasn't that. This wasn't external pressure. This was internal erosion. And I had mistaken it for normal marriage stress. Around noon, I checked my phone again. A message from Daniel. "Don't overreact about yesterday. The kids are fine." I stared at the screen for a long time. Not because I was confused. Because I wasn't. That sentence wasn't reassurance. It was instruction. Don't react. Don't question. Don't escalate. I placed the phone down slowly and walked into the living room. That's when I noticed something I hadn't fully processed before. The way Emily sat the night before. The way she looked between us. The way she froze when he spoke. It wasn't just confusion. It was alignment forming. And I had allowed it to happen by staying quiet for too long. I sat down on the couch and replayed everything in my mind from the past year. Not arguments. Not isolated incidents. Patterns. Small corrections in front of the kids. Subtle contradictions after I spoke. Private conversations I wasn't part of. Moments where Emily started looking at him first instead of me. And slowly, painfully, I saw it. He wasn't just reacting to me. He was repositioning me. Not as a partner, but as an option. A secondary authority in my own home. And the slap wasn't the beginning of that. It was just the first time he did it openly. That realization sat heavy in my chest. But it didn't break me. It sharpened me. Because now I understood what I was dealing with. This wasn't a man losing control. This was a man trying to consolidate it. And somewhere in that process, he had miscalculated one thing. He thought I was still participating in the same emotional system he was controlling. But I wasn't anymore. I stood up, walked to the kitchen drawer, and pulled out a notebook. Not a dramatic gesture. Not a revenge moment. Just procedure. And I began writing again. But this time I wasn't documenting confusion. I was documenting structure. And structure can be understood. And if it can be understood, it can be dismantled. 2 days passed after the slap. No apology came. Not even a half-hearted one. Instead, Daniel acted like he had simply drawn a line in the house that everyone was expected to step over without looking down. That was his pattern. If something uncomfortable happened, he didn't repair it. He redirected it. That morning, he was already in the kitchen when I came down. Coffee brewing, radio on low volume, the same normal routine he used when he wanted to pretend everything was fine. Emily sat at the table scrolling on her phone. Jason was still upstairs getting ready. Daniel didn't look at me when he spoke. "Kids are staying with me after school today," he said. Not a question. A decision. I stopped at the counter watching him carefully. "We didn't discuss that." He finally looked up. "We don't need to discuss everything." That sentence hit differently now. Not because it was new. Because I was finally hearing what it really meant. "You don't get a voice here." Emily didn't look up, but I saw her fingers pause on her phone for half a second. She was listening. Always listening. Just not sure who she was supposed to believe anymore. I kept my voice steady. "I'd like to know what's changing." Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair. "Nothing is changing. I'm just spending more time with them." There it was again. Them. Not us. Not family. A separation had already been created in how he spoke. I nodded slowly like I accepted it. But inside, something had already shifted in me completely. Because I realized something important. The slap hadn't created this dynamic. It had exposed it. That was the difference I had been missing. People think a breaking point is when everything falls apart. But in reality, the breaking point is when the truth becomes visible enough that you can no longer ignore it. Jason came downstairs then, breaking the tension without even realizing it. He grabbed cereal, sat next to me, and started talking about school again like nothing in the world had changed. Kids adapt faster than adults sometimes. They normalize what they don't yet understand. But Emily, she stayed quiet. Too quiet. That silence wasn't peace. It was observation. And observation in a household like this meant decisions were being formed. After they left for school, I stayed behind in the kitchen longer than usual. Not because I was lost, because I was recalibrating. I opened my notebook again and reviewed what I had written over the past 2 days. Patterns, phrases, behaviors. And then I added something new. Not an incident. An interpretation. He is not reacting to conflict. He is restructuring hierarchy. Writing that sentence felt strange. Not emotional. Clinical, but necessary. Because I could no longer afford to interpret this situation like a wife trying to preserve a marriage. I had to interpret it like someone analyzing a system. That afternoon, something happened that changed the temperature of the entire house again. Emily came home first. She didn't come to the kitchen. She went straight to her room. That had never been her pattern before. 5 minutes later, Daniel came in. And he wasn't calm this time. I could tell immediately from the way he shut the door harder than necessary. He didn't speak at first, just stood in the entryway like he was thinking through something he didn't like. Then he looked at me. "She said something at school," he said. I stayed still. "Who said something?" "Emily," he replied sharply. My stomach tightened slightly, but I didn't move. "What did she say?" He exhaled through his nose. "She told her teacher you and I are having problems." That was new. And dangerous. Not because it was false, but because it was externalized. Once children speak outside the home, the private system becomes public narrative. I nodded slowly. And what exactly was said? Daniel stepped closer. "She said you two argue. A lot." I didn't respond immediately. Because I understood something in that moment. Emily wasn't taking sides yet. She was trying to understand reality by testing it outside the house. That is what children do when they are no longer certain which version of home is real. But Daniel didn't see it that way. He saw exposure. He saw threat. And that meant his behavior would escalate. "You need to fix this," he said. That word again. Fix. Like I was responsible for stabilizing a system I didn't create. I met his eyes. I can't fix what I didn't cause. That was the first time I pushed back without emotion. Just truth. His face tightened immediately. "You're turning her against me," he said. That sentence hung in the air longer than anything else. Because it revealed the direction he was choosing. Blame. Not reflection. Not accountability. Blame. I felt something shift inside me again, not anger but clarity. Because now I understood the trajectory. He wasn't going to de-escalate this. He was going to escalate it until someone else accepted responsibility for it. And that someone would always be me. But something in me had already stepped outside that equation. I looked at him calmly and said, "I'm not turning her against you." A pause. Then I added, "She's starting to see things without you explaining them first." That was the truth. And truth, when spoken clearly, doesn't need volume. It just needs space. Daniel didn't respond right away. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in him. Not guilt. Not remorse. But disruption. Because the system he had been building was no longer behaving predictably. And he didn't know how to regain control of it yet. I turned away before he could answer, not because I was avoiding him, because I no longer needed to participate in that moment. And as I walked down the hallway, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted yet. The slap wasn't the beginning of his control. It was the moment he lost the ability to maintain it quietly. And what came after that was going to collapse in ways he still didn't understand. By the end of that week, the house didn't feel like it used to. It wasn't louder. It was more divided. People think tension always shows up as shouting or arguments, but in reality, the most dangerous kind of tension is quiet. The kind where everyone starts adjusting their behavior just to avoid triggering something they don't fully understand. Daniel still acted like he was in control. But control is only real when it doesn't need to be constantly reinforced. And he was starting to reinforce it too often. That morning I noticed it at breakfast. Emily didn't sit where she normally sat. She chose the chair furthest from both of us. Jason sat beside me like always, but even he was quieter now. Not afraid, just aware that something in the house had changed shape. Daniel watched Emily for a moment longer than necessary. Then he spoke. "You don't have to act weird in your own house," he said. Emily didn't respond right away. She just kept looking at her bowl. That silence used to belong to me. Now it was spreading. I watched carefully, not to intervene, not to correct, just to understand. Because I had stopped trying to fix emotional dynamics I didn't create. That was the shift. Daniel leaned back. "If something is wrong, we talk about it as a family." But the way he said family didn't include all of us anymore. It was becoming conditional. After breakfast, he left for work earlier than usual. The moment the front door closed, Emily stood up from the table. She hesitated. Then she walked toward me. That was new. She stopped a few feet away like she wasn't sure if I was still the same person she used to run to without thinking. "Mom," she said quietly, then corrected herself halfway through like she wasn't allowed to fully land on the word. "I mean, I didn't push her. I just waited." She looked down. "Dad says you guys argue a lot because you don't understand each other." That sentence didn't surprise me anymore, but hearing it from her still carried weight. Because now it wasn't about him anymore. It was about what she believed was stable. I spoke carefully. "Do you feel like you're being asked to choose?" She shook her head quickly. "No, I just don't understand why everything feels different lately." That was the most honest thing she had said in days, and it told me something important. She wasn't aligned yet. She was disoriented. And disorientation is a temporary state, but it can be shaped in either direction depending on who provides clarity first. I nodded slowly. "Things feel different because people are talking to you about problems you were never meant to carry." She looked up at me then, and for a second I saw the child I had raised. Not the confusion, not the influence, just her. But it faded quickly when she stepped back slightly, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to trust what she felt. That was when I realized how fragile the situation had become. Not broken, but fragile enough that one more push in the wrong direction would change everything permanently. Later that afternoon, Daniel called me from work. That alone was unusual. He usually texted unless he wanted immediate control over tone and reaction. I answered. His voice was tight. "She told me you talked to her this morning." I stayed still. She came to me. A pause. "You need to stop discussing our problems with her," he said. That word again. Our. As if the problem belonged equally to both of us regardless of origin. I took a breath. I didn't discuss anything. She asked a question. His voice lowered. "You're making her uncomfortable." That line was familiar now. It wasn't about her comfort. It was about narrative control. I walked toward the window and looked outside. The street was normal, quiet. People living their lives without knowing how fragile other houses can be behind closed doors. "I'm not doing anything to her," I said calmly, "but she's old enough to notice things." That was when his tone changed. "You think you're better at this than I am?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately, because I was no longer interested in that kind of argument. Instead, I said something that shifted the air between us. "I think the kids are starting to decide what they feel without needing permission." Silence on the line. That silence told me more than words could have, because for the first time he didn't have an immediate response. And when someone used to control the rhythm of conversations loses timing, they start to lose confidence. After the call ended, I sat down again at the kitchen table. I opened my notebook, and I added one final observation. He believes control is still intact, but the system is now reacting without him. That was the truth, because control doesn't collapse in a single moment. It collapses when the people inside the system stop needing permission to think. And that had already started. Quietly. Irreversibly. I knew something had changed the morning Emily didn't wait for her father's opinion before speaking to me. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was small, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. But in a house like ours, small things were never just small things. She came into the kitchen while I was making coffee. Jason was still upstairs. Daniel had already left for work. The house felt like it could finally breathe again. Emily stood by the counter for a moment, then said quietly, "Mom, can I ask you something?" That word "mom" came out more naturally this time, not corrected halfway, not pulled back. Just said. I turned slightly, of course. She hesitated. Did I do something wrong? My chest tightened a little, not because she had hurt me, but because I understood exactly where that question came from. Children don't ask that when they feel safe. They ask it when they feel uncertain about whether their presence is causing instability. I set the mug down slowly. "No," I said. "You didn't do anything wrong." She looked down at her hands. "Dad says I'm confused." I stayed quiet for a moment. Because this was the point where everything could either heal or fracture further. Not because of what I said, but because of what she believed after I said it. So I chose my words carefully. "You're not confused," I said gently. "You're noticing things that don't match." She looked up at me, and I saw it, the internal conflict trying to settle. Not loyalty. Not rebellion. Just a child trying to understand reality without hurting anyone she loves. "I don't like when you and Dad are upset," she admitted. That was honest. And heartbreaking in the simplest way. I nodded. Neither do I. Silence followed. Not the heavy kind anymore. Something softer. More human. That afternoon, Daniel came home earlier than usual. I could tell immediately that something had shifted in him. Not confidence, not anger, but pressure. Like he had been carrying conversations in his head all day, and none of them ended the way he wanted. He didn't greet me when he walked in. Instead, he looked straight at Emily. "Can we talk?" he asked her. She froze slightly, then nodded. They went into the living room. I didn't follow. Not because I didn't care. Because I finally understood something important. I could not be the emotional referee in a system someone else was trying to control through fear and interpretation. So I stayed in the kitchen. But I listened. Not to every word, just to tone. At first his voice was calm, controlled, measured. Then sharper. Then defensive. Then quieter again. That pattern told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't resolving anything. He was trying to regain narrative authority. A few minutes later, Emily came out first. Her face was unreadable at first. Not crying. Not angry. Just distant. She looked at me briefly, then went upstairs without saying anything. Daniel came into the kitchen right after. And for the first time since everything started, he didn't look like he was sure of himself. "She's twisting things," he said immediately. I didn't respond right away. Because I had learned something in the military years ago that applied perfectly here. When someone is losing control of perception, they will always try to recruit you back into their version of reality. I leaned against the counter. "She's trying to understand what she feels." His jaw tightened. "You're letting her turn against me." That sentence no longer had power over me. Not because I didn't hear it, but because I understood it. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about his inability to accept that influence is not ownership. So I said something calm. "She's not turning against you," I replied. "She's starting to think independently." That word independently hit harder than anything else I could have said, because I saw it in his expression. A crack. Not rage, not denial. Something closer to realization. That the structure he believed he controlled was no longer responding the way it used to. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You think you're doing the right thing." It wasn't a question. It was a warning wrapped in disappointment. I nodded slightly. I think I'm no longer participating in something that isn't healthy for them. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The house felt still again. But it wasn't the same stillness as before. This one didn't feel like control. It felt like consequence arriving slowly in real time without needing permission. Daniel finally looked away, and for the first time since I met him, he didn't try to argue back. He just walked out of the room. Later that night, Emily came downstairs again. This time, she didn't go to either of us first. She stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked between the two of us like she was making a decision that had nothing to do with loyalty. Then she said softly, "I just want things to feel normal again." I stood up slowly. "They will," I said. "But normal has to be honest first." She nodded slightly. Not agreement, but understanding. And that was enough. That night after everyone went to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table one last time. I didn't write in my notebook. I didn't plan anything. I just reflected. Because this wasn't a story about revenge in the way people usually expect. There were no dramatic victories, no courtroom moments, no loud endings, just a slow unraveling of control that had once felt normal. And I understood something clearly now. He didn't lose everything because I took it from him. He lost it because the truth stopped needing his version to exist. And in the silence that followed, there was no celebration. Only clarity. Only distance. Only what comes after control finally stops working. I finished my coffee, turned off the kitchen light, and walked toward the hallway where my children slept. Not as someone seeking revenge, but as someone finally living in reality again. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. I gently closed the door behind me and let the house be quiet.